What's up everybody, back out and about today, walking the dogs for a change, and I thought we'd talk today about a technical change in Formula 1 that cropped up in the live show that I did on Monday night, but also one that's kind of gone under the radar a little bit. Didn't have a huge amount of discussion around it, and yet I think it could have a reasonably significant effect on the cars and the performance of some of those cars for 2021. Of course, I'm talking about the changes, the technical changes to the car's floor area, which are coming in for next season, 2021, despite the fact that the cars, in their majority, are carrying over from this year to next. Well, let's look at what those changes are, because if you look at a Formula 1 car today from above, you'll see that the outer edges of the car's floor run parallel with each other all the way from the side of the cockpit all the way back to the front of the rear tyre. Next year that'll be different. There'll be a 10cm taper inwards on either side just ahead of the rear tyre, i.e. the back end of the floor at the point where the rear tyres are will be overall 20 centimetres narrower than it is today. That means there's a huge or a considerable amount of less floor area to use for generating downforce. And the whole point of these changes are they are trying to reduce the downforce and therefore reduce the speeds of the car to enable this year's tyres, created by Pirelli, to carry over to next year without having to develop and spend money on developing a whole new suite of tyres to accommodate what would otherwise be normal development progress over the course of this year and next. Because the 18-inch tyres were due to come in 2021, have now been pushed back to 2022, of course, Pirelli are reluctant to spend a huge amount of money on developing another set of tyres for what will be just 1 year before they all go in the bin and the 18-inch tyres come into play. So an understandable change, that's why it's been put in place. They are trying to slow the cars down, and they suspect that by making this change it will reduce lap times on average by around half a second a lap. There are also some other not inconsequential changes as well. There are changes to the tyre squirt slots. Those are the sort of horizontal slots that run just in front of the rear tyres that prevent the squirt, the airflow that's squirting out as the rotating tyre makes contact with the racetrack, preventing that airflow squirting out of there and interfering with the flow coming through to the diffuser, that critical flow that helps to generate so much of the car's downforce. Those tyre squirt slots have become a really big area of development. All of those slots and work you see around the front of the rear tyres, that's all going to go. You also know that there are some longitudinal slots that run pretty much the full length of the car's floor on the outsides. Those are there at the moment to help seal off the underside of the floor. Again, to maintain that flow path, that critical flow path, maintain the air pressure. Oh, Wilson! Maintain that critical flow path through towards the diffuser. Those longitudinal slots along the length of the car's floor are also being banned from next year. Have we got water on the lens here? Wilson's just got out the river and shaken. Don't know if that's made it better or worse. So the point is, next year the car's floor will be one solid block rather than being the intricate, detailed selection of slots and flaps and flick-ups that we see today. That is going to have a relatively significant impact on the performance of the floor. So who will this affect more? Well, the obvious thought process is that it will affect more the teams that use that floor in the most efficient and the greater way. And you've got to say that at the moment that is the guys who run the high rate concept, Red Bull being the leader of that particular pack. What they do with their concept is they make that the priority, the focus of their downforce producing element at the underside of the car. And by tipping the rear end of the car up with a high rate concept, not only do you maximise the efficiency of the diffuser, maximise the effect of the diffuser, effectively what you're doing is turning the entire underside of the car into a huge expansion chamber, which is essentially what the diffuser is. You take that really high speed, low pressure airflow that runs through the underside of the car, and the diffuser then expands that into the ambient pressure at the rear of the car. That's where you start to pull all that airflow through from underneath the car, and that's where you suck the car down to the racetrack and generate downforce. By tipping the entire car up in the way that they do, you have the potential to have an even greater effect of that process. Now, if they're focusing most of their downforce generating concept on the way that this floor operates, by reducing the floor's area and the intricacy around it to enable it to work better, by reducing that overall, perhaps you're going to hit that team or those teams in a greater way than you would with some of the teams that rely less on that particular effect. So does that then mean that Red Bull are going to be hit hard and they will struggle in 2021, given that they've got to carry the current car over into next year, and yet they will potentially be hampered by this aerodynamic restriction that at the moment works so well for them? Yes and no. And the reason I say that is not necessarily. They are still one of the biggest teams, one of the most well-funded teams, one of the teams that have the biggest and best set of resources, particularly in aerodynamic terms. That's why they've been leaders in concepts like the high rake concept. And incidentally, the high rake is not simply about raising the rear end of the car up and maximising the underside of the floor. It also has other knock-on effects, like the changing the effect of the front wing, because by tipping the rear end of the car up, you also tip down the nose cone, and therefore the front wing runs much closer to the racetrack. It gets much more of a ground effect situation going on, and that's the way that Red Bull have operated over so many years. They've been very clever in maximising that type of concept, which, by the way, is not an easy thing to run, and certainly not an easy thing to stabilise and make sure your downforce generation is stable all the way through a lap and in all different conditions. Red Bull have become very, very good at doing that. I don't necessarily expect them to suddenly ditch the high rake concept because of this, not at all, because their entire car is centred around it. And don't forget, this is the final year in 2021 when this type of car will be in operation. So for any team to dramatically change their concept at this point would be a huge risk, and perhaps something that would take them some while to develop and to learn, to understand and to catch up with, given that they've only got one season with it. So I don't expect them to change their concept. What I do expect to happen is to have lots of work being done around the barge board area, around the side pod area, and around the brake duct area, other areas that might be able to mitigate some of the lost downforce points that these changes will inevitably make. That's going to be some of the biggest areas of development next year, and where perhaps we'll see a real battleground in aerodynamic terms in trying to recover some of that lost aero. It's one of the things that Formula One teams are very, very good at. So where you get the big teams with the big resources, and the reason I say Red Bull is because they're so strong in aerodynamic terms, they will also have the best opportunity to deal with the changes that are coming their way. The other variable, albeit a small one, that will determine how these changes affect certain teams will be dependent on the wheelbase of the cars. The teams that have a greater or a longer wheelbase effectively already have more floor area to work with. It's one of the reasons they go with a longer wheelbase car, because more floor area means more potential for creating downforce, more bodywork to stretch across the length of the car for the same reason. So those teams will be hit slightly less, given that they already have a greater area of floor to work with. And tapering off that 10 centimetres on either side, yes, will of course hit them, but perhaps not quite as much as those that have a shorter wheelbase car. Typically, the teams that have a flatter aero platform, like a Mercedes, like a Racing Point, as opposed to the high rake concept of Red Bull and many others, typically the flatter cars tend to have a longer wheelbase for the reason that they need a bit more length on the car to generate similar levels of downforce to those that are alternatively doing it using that high angle of rake to create their downforce. The flatter platform gives a much more stable platform. It's much easier to control that downforce generation, whereas the high rake concept is very kind of tricky to get right in all conditions, because the car's constantly moving and bumping around the racetrack, constantly changing that angle. Therefore the downforce that's produced is also constantly changing. And if that's not very, very meticulously and carefully managed, from a driver's perspective, your centre of pressure, or the point of the car where the downforce is being produced at its maximum, can be constantly moving around the car. That's not a great way to be. That's why we have a split in the paddock right now. Some teams choosing to go for the potential maximum downforce that high rake offers, others going for the potentially more stable, more easy to control, flatter aero concept. Looking at these changes, you've got to say that the teams like Mercedes and Racing Point may well have an initial advantage given the changes that are coming their way.